The golden glow of the late afternoon sun draped over the sprawling expanse of Willowridge Park, a rare haven of tranquility nestled within the heart of a bustling city. Rays of light filtered through the thick canopy of ancient oak trees, dappling the cobblestone paths and shimmering off the gentle ripples of the lake nearby. Birds chirped in soft symphonies, their melodies weaving through the air, mingling with the distant laughter of children and the rhythmic crunch of joggers. Against gravel, on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the lake, Darius Coleman, a well-built black man in his early 40s, sat in quiet solace, absorbed in the pages of a worn-out novel. His sharp brown eyes traced the words, his fingers absent-mindedly grazing the dog-eared corners of the book. This park had always been his retreat, a place where he could steal a few precious moments away from the weight of responsibility that came with his job in federal law enforcement. But even as he turned the page, he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Across the park, Officer Wade Harper, a grizzled veteran of the Willowridge Police Department, patrolled his usual route with the confidence of a man who believed he knew the city better than anyone. His weathered face, lined from years of what he considered gut instinct policing, was set in a firm scowl as his sharp blue eyes flicked across the park-goers. He wasn't just patrolling, he was hunting for something, someone, out of place. And then he saw him. A black man, alone, too calm, too composed, too unfamiliar. Harper's steps slowed, his grip tightening on his baton. A flicker of recognition, or rather, an assumption, flashed across his mind. The department had received reports about a string of petty thefts and burglaries in the neighborhood. No concrete description, no clear suspect, just a vague profile, a tall black man in dark clothing. That was enough for Harper. Enough to justify his creeping suspicion. He muttered under his breath, adjusting his belt as he took a step forward. Darius, sensing the presence closing in on him, exhaled slowly. He had seen this play out before. Too many times. The calculated scrutiny, the deliberate approach, the weight of suspicion in an officer's gaze. It was a story as old as time. He closed his book with a measured motion, marking the page with his finger, and turned his head slightly, meeting the officer's gaze. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a firm, quiet understanding of the inevitable. Harper felt a jolt of irritation. He didn't like that look. The calmness, the lack of fear. It made him uneasy, like he was losing control of the narrative before it had even begun. Determined to assert his authority, he strode forward, his polished boots crunching against the gravel as he reached the bench. "Afternoon," Harper said, his voice tight, clipped with an edge of preemptive accusation rather than greeting. Darius nodded. "Afternoon, officer." His voice was even, unshaken. His hands remained in clear view, resting atop his book. "What brings you out here today?" Harper's gaze flicked to the book, then back to Darius's face, scanning for any tells, any nervous twitch, any excuse to justify the feeling gnawing at him. Darius leaned back slightly. "Just enjoying the park. It's a nice day." Harper narrowed his eyes. The response was too smooth, too rehearsed. "You from around here?" Darius let a small, knowing smile flicker across his face, one that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around." The vague answer bristled Harper. It felt evasive. He shifted his weight, his posture turning more rigid, more confrontational. "Mind if I see some ID?" There it was, the tipping point. Darius's expression hardened, though his voice remained calm. "Am I under arrest?" Harper's nostrils flared at the defiance, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. "You will be if you don't cooperate." Darius took a slow, deliberate breath. He knew the game, knew exactly how easy it was for a situation like this to spiral. Still, he wasn't about to cower. "I'm just sitting in a public park." "Officer, is there a law against that?" Harper's jaw tightened. He didn't like being questioned. Didn't like the way this man carried himself, with confidence, with certainty. It grated against the instincts he had spent years cultivating. Instincts that told him that black and suspicious were interchangeable words. He needed an excuse. Any excuse. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," Harper said, even though he knew the words sounded flimsy even to himself. Darius tilted his head slightly. His dark eyes locked onto Harper's. "And what description is that?" "Exactly?" Silence. A hesitation. A crack in the officer's facade. Harper knew he had nothing solid, nothing concrete, but his pride refused to let him back down. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Show me some ID. Now." The two men stared at each other, the air between them thick with a tension that had existed for generations. Darius had choices. He could assert his rights and refuse. Or he could comply, knowing full well that even compliance didn't guarantee safety. After a long pause, he reached into his pocket, slow and deliberate, and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his ID without a word. Harper snatched it, barely glancing at the name before barking his next order. "Stand up." Darius inhaled sharply but obeyed, rising to his feet with calculated ease. "Turn around." For the first time, Darius's mask of patience wavered, replaced with a flicker of exhaustion, of disappointment, of a battle too often fought. He turned, felt the cold bite of metal as Harper cuffed his wrists, too tight, like he needed to make a point, as if control was slipping through his fingers and this was the only way to reclaim it. Nearby, passers-by slowed their steps, murmurs rippling through the air. A few pulled out their phones, cameras clicking on, but Darius didn't flinch. He had already decided he wouldn't fight. He wouldn't resist. He would let the officer's mistake unfold on its own. As Harper gripped his arm and led him toward the patrol car, a creeping sense of unease settled in his chest. Something about this felt off. But his pride, his authority, wouldn't let him reconsider. Not yet. Darius, sitting in the backseat of the squad car, exhaled. He wasn't worried. Not for himself. He already knew how this story would end. He knew that in a matter of minutes, Harper's world would shatter. Because soon enough, Harper would realize the truth. The man he had just arrested wasn't just anyone. He was Special Agent Darius Coleman, Federal Bureau of Investigation. And when that realization struck, when the weight of the mistake sank in, the balance of power would shift. But not just for him, for every officer who had ever let their prejudices outweigh their duty. The station's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, their cold glow casting stark shadows across the tiled floors. The moment Darius Coleman stepped through the heavy glass doors, his wrists still cuffed tightly behind his back, the air in the precinct seemed to shift. The few officers lingering near the booking desk took notice, their conversations pausing, eyes flicking toward the new arrival. Some simply glanced, indifferent, while others lingered, curiosity or unease settling in their expressions. To them, he was just another suspect, another man in handcuffs. But to Captain Laura Bennett, the moment she caught sight of him, he was something else entirely. Her sharp blue eyes widened slightly, the paperwork in her hand momentarily forgotten as she took in the scene unfolding before her. Officer Wade Harper stood stiffly behind Darius, a hand still gripping the cuffs as if unsure whether to tighten them further. His face was unreadable, but his posture betrayed an unease he hadn't felt when he first made the arrest. He had been so sure, so confident that he was doing his job. But now, under the fluorescent glare of the precinct, where scrutiny was harsher and consequences were real, doubt crept into the edges of his mind. "Officer Harper." Bennett's voice cut through the low murmur of the station, firm and expectant. "What's this about?" Harper squared his shoulders, clearing his throat. "Caught this guy acting suspicious in the park," he said, lifting Darius's ID in one hand as if it was evidence of something more than mere presence. "Wouldn't cooperate at first. Fit the general description of a suspect we've been looking for." The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably. Bennett's eyes flicked from Harper to the man in cuffs, scanning his face for any trace of recognition. Then, it clicked. Darius Coleman. Not just any man. Special Agent Darius Coleman, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Bennett sucked in a breath, masking the sharp realization with a slow exhale. If Harper had done even a fraction of due diligence, he would have known. If he had taken even a moment to ask the right questions instead of assuming, this entire situation could have been avoided. But here they were. Darius met her gaze, and in his eyes, there was no panic, no indignation, just a cold, resigned patience, a look that said he had been here before, that he had long since learned that fighting, resisting, or arguing would only escalate things. And despite the heavy coil of anger tightening in her gut, she knew he was right. Bennett turned back to Harper, leveling him with a stare. "Suspicious behavior? What, exactly, did that entail?" Harper shifted slightly, sitting alone, Wouldn't give a straight answer when questioned. Sitting alone in a public park is suspicious now? Her voice was even, but there was an edge to it. A sharpness that made Harper straighten his stance. And when, exactly, did he refuse to cooperate? Well, Harper hesitated, eyes darting toward Darius before looking away. He questioned why I was asking for his ID. Asked if he was under arrest. Bennett arched an eyebrow. Which, by the way, is his right. Harper clenched his jaw, but remained silent. The station had fallen deathly quiet now. The quiet hum of background noise had ceased. Every officer within earshot suddenly finding themselves invested in the conversation. The weight of it hung in the air, thick and charged. Bennett turned to the officer at the booking desk. Jenkins, check that ID. Jenkins hesitated only for a second before typing swiftly into his computer. Within moments, his brows lifted, his mouth parting slightly in recognition before he turned the screen toward Bennett. She barely had to read it. Special Agent Darius Coleman. Her stomach twisted. God, Harper, what have you done? She turned back to Darius. Her expression shifting, softening just slightly. Agent Coleman. The title alone sent a visible ripple through the room. Harper went rigid, his face draining of color. Bennett almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Darius gave a small nod, his gaze unwavering. Captain. Bennett sighed, rubbing a hand down her face before nodding toward Jenkins. Take off the cuffs. Harper visibly tensed. Captain. Now. Officer Harper. There was no room for argument. Harper swallowed hard and, with stiff hands, unlocked the cuffs. Darius exhaled as he rubbed his wrists. But still, his expression did not change. There was no satisfaction, no smugness, just quiet exhaustion, the kind that came from experience. Bennett turned to Harper once more. You do realize what you've done, don't you? Her voice was lower now, laced with something almost dangerous. You arrested an FBI agent. Based on nothing. Harper's mouth opened, then closed again. What was there to say? That he hadn't known? That it was an honest mistake? Because the problem wasn't that he had arrested an FBI agent. The problem was that he hadn't given him the benefit of the doubt until he realized who he was. Bennett exhaled sharply, shaking her head. We'll talk about this later. Then, turning back to Darius, she straightened. Agent Coleman, I sincerely apologize for this mistake. Darius tilted his head slightly. You don't have to apologize, Captain, but I hope you understand why I didn't just tell him who I was. Bennett nodded grimly. I do, because it shouldn't have mattered. His title, his badge, his credentials, none of it should have been the determining factor in how he was treated. Another silence stretched between them, this one heavier. Then, Darius took a step forward, rolling his shoulders back as if shedding the weight of the past hour. I'll be in touch, he said quietly. Bennett didn't need to ask what he meant. The consequences of this mistake wouldn't end here. With that, Darius turned and walked out of the station. His head held high. The quiet chatter returned as officers murmured amongst themselves. The weight of the moment settling over the precinct like an approaching storm. And Harper? Harper remained standing in place. The full weight of what he had done sinking in like lead. The power had shifted, and nothing would be the same after that. The precinct was eerily silent. The kind of hush that followed a storm but preceded a reckoning. Officer Wade Harper sat stiffly in a chair in Captain Laura Bennett's office. His jaw tight, hands clenched into fists on his lap. The gravity of the situation had finally settled in. Across from him, the captain leaned forward, her sharp gaze piercing through the tension hanging thick in the air. The screen on her desk displayed the official report, the bold letters standing out in damning clarity. Special Agent Darius Coleman, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The moment those words had been uttered in the precinct, Harper had felt the air sucked from his lungs. He had spent years patrolling the streets, making snap judgments based on experience, or at least, that was how he justified it. But now, it was painfully clear that his experience had led him into a catastrophic mistake. Officer Harper. Bennett's voice was measured, controlled, but there was an edge of restrained disappointment laced within it. Do you understand the severity of what you've done? Harper swallowed hard. Captain, no, she cut him off. Her tone firm. No excuses. No justifications. You arrested a man, an innocent man, because he was black and sitting alone in a park. And the only reason we're even having this conversation is because you found out he wasn't just any black man." Harper shifted uncomfortably. He wanted to defend himself, to insist that he had been following protocol. But the reality of it all was sinking in deeper with each passing second. If Coleman hadn't been FBI, if he had been just another man, another citizen with no badge to shield him from injustice, what would have happened then? The door opened, and Officer Jenkins stepped in, nodding at Bennett before placing a file on her desk. "The review board hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Internal Affairs will be present." He shot a glance at Harper, his expression unreadable before he exited. Tomorrow, less than 24 hours from now, Harper would have to sit before a panel and justify his actions. And there was no way to spin it, no way to paint himself in a better light. The footage from his body camera had already been reviewed. His confrontation with Coleman had played out in high definition, each frame another nail in the coffin of his defense. As if reading his thoughts, Bennett exhaled, rubbing her temples. "The body cam footage is damning. Harper, it's not just that you arrested him, it's how you did it. The aggression, the way you dismissed his words, the assumption that he was guilty before you even had a shred of evidence." She shook her head. "That's not policing. That's prejudice." Harper felt something twist in his gut, something that felt dangerously close to shame. The hearing room the next morning was packed. Officers, department heads, representatives from Internal Affairs, all gathered to watch one man account for his actions. Harper sat at the long table, his badge feeling heavier on his chest than it ever had before. Across from him, Agent Coleman sat, his expression unreadable, but his presence alone was enough to remind Harper of the weight of his mistake. A senior official cleared his throat, bringing the room to order. "Officer Harper, you are here today to address the events that took place in Willow Ridge Park 2 days ago. Please explain your reasoning for detaining Mr. Coleman." Harper's throat was dry, and for the first time in his career, words failed him. He could see it now. In brutal clarity, there was no reasonable defense. There was no hiding behind his badge. He had been wrong, and now the entire room was waiting for him to admit it. He inhaled shakily. I made an error in judgment." A pause. Then a quiet hum of murmurs rippled through the room. "An error in judgment?" Captain Bennett echoed, her brows raised. "That's all you have to say?" Harper hesitated before looking at Coleman. The agent had yet to speak, had yet to voice his thoughts. But the silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. It was a silence filled with expectation, waiting for Harper to come to terms with the truth. "I let my bias dictate my actions," Harper finally admitted, his voice lower now. He could feel the gazes locked onto him, scrutinizing every syllable. "I saw a black man sitting alone in the park and assumed he was a threat. I ignored the lack of evidence. I dismissed his words. I treated him like a suspect because of how he looked, not because of what he did." The room remained silent, as if everyone was processing the weight of the confession. Even Bennett looked slightly surprised. Harper had never been one to admit fault easily. The official at the head of the table nodded. "Officer Harper, given your admission and the evidence presented, we will be deliberating on the appropriate course of action. But be assured, there will be consequences." The meeting adjourned, and the crowd slowly dispersed. Harper remained seated, staring blankly at the table in front of him. It was done. The truth was out. Coleman stood, adjusting his suit jacket before making his way over. Harper braced himself, expecting some harsh words, some well-deserved anger. But instead, Coleman simply said, "It's not about what you intended. It's about what you did. Remember that." Then, he walked away, leaving Harper alone with the weight of his actions. And now, the story takes a twist you won't see coming. Just when Harper thinks his career is over, an unexpected call from an unlikely source changes everything. What happens next will leave you on the edge of your seat. If you've been following this journey, hit that like button to show your support for accountability and change. Let's make sure these conversations continue. Stay tuned, because the next chapter? It's going to be explosive. The precinct had never felt heavier than it did in the days following the review board hearing. The air itself seemed thick with the weight of expectation and judgment. A silent understanding that something had fundamentally shifted. Officer Wade Harper had returned to his desk, though it no longer felt like his own. The murmurs of his colleagues, the side glances, the subtle shift in the way they spoke to him, it was all different now. He had been a fixture in the department for years. A man who once held his badge with pride. But now? Now he was just another cautionary tale. A living, breathing example of what happened when bias overshadowed duty. But what made it worse, what made it unbearable, was that he knew he deserved it. The hearing had been his last stand. A final attempt to explain himself. But no justification could undo what had been done. He had arrested an innocent man. And worse, he had done it for no reason beyond his own ingrained prejudices. He had thought himself a good cop. Thought himself someone who upheld the law without bias. But now, stripped bare of excuses, he saw the truth staring back at him. And it was ugly. Across the city, Darius Coleman sat in Captain Bennett's office, watching as she sorted through documents, each page representing a step toward systemic change. Darius had made it clear from the start, he wasn't interested in vengeance. Firing Harper wouldn't fix the problem, nor would it erase the countless others who had faced similar injustices. If there was to be change, it had to be real, had to be woven into the very fabric of how the department functioned. Bennett had listened. More than that, she had understood. She had seen the cracks in the system, had witnessed firsthand how one officer's bias could lead to a mistake that unraveled lives. And so, she committed. New training programs were implemented, ones that went beyond the perfunctory sessions officers had become accustomed to. They were raw, immersive, and unflinching, forcing officers to confront their own biases in ways that were uncomfortable but necessary. Accountability measures were tightened. No more slaps on the wrist. No more looking the other way. Every complaint, every incident, would be examined with the scrutiny it deserved. And most importantly, the culture within the department began to change. Slowly, but surely, officers started questioning their own instincts. Started recognizing that their first impression of a suspect might not be the right one. It wasn't a perfect system. Change never was, but it was something. And for Darius, that was enough. Not justice, but progress. But for Harper, there was no redemption, at least not within the walls of the department he had once called home. The final blow came in the form of a termination notice. The stark, black lettering on the page sealing his fate. It wasn't a surprise, he had known it was coming. But knowing didn't make it easier. He packed up his things in silence. His hands steady but his mind a storm of regrets. The whispers followed him as he walked down the hallway one last time. Past the faces of men and women who once respected him. Past the memories of a career that had, in his mind, meant something. And then, he was outside, the cold air hitting him like a slap. Reality settling in. His life as a cop was over. At first, he thought about fighting it. Thought about pleading his case. But what was there to fight for? The truth was, he had done this to himself. So instead, he walked until his legs ached. Until the city around him blurred into something unrecognizable. He ended up at a bar, somewhere dimly lit. The kind of place where no one asked questions. He ordered a drink, but when he lifted the glass to his lips, he found he couldn't take the first sip. What was there to drown? What pain could be numbed when he had been the architect of his own downfall? He set the glass down and exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. For the first time, he let himself feel it. The loss, the shame, the loneliness that clung to him like a second skin. And then, a voice. "You look like a man who just lost everything." Harper turned, startled to find Darius standing beside him. His expression unreadable. Of all the people he expected to see tonight, Darius Coleman was the last. Harper straightened, unsure of what to say. What was there to say? "What are you doing here?" he asked finally. His voice rough, tired. Darius shrugged, taking the seat next to him. "Heard you got fired." Harper let out a humorless laugh. "That's putting it lightly." For a long moment, there was silence between them. Not tense, not heavy, just still. And then, Darius spoke again, his tone quieter this time. "I didn't want this." Harper looked at him then. Really looked at him. "You sure about that?" Darius nodded. "Yeah, you losing your job doesn't fix anything. Doesn't change what happened to me. Or what's happened to others like me." Harper exhaled slowly. "Then why does it feel like the right punishment?" Darius was quiet for a moment before saying, "Because it's easier to punish one man than to fix the system." Harper turned that over in his mind, staring down at his untouched drink. He had spent the last few days thinking about his mistake in the simplest terms. "I was wrong. Now I'm paying the price." But now? Now, he wondered if Darius was right. His firing wasn't a solution. It was an example, a warning to other officers to think before they acted, to consider their own biases before making choices that couldn't be undone. But if the system didn't change, if officers weren't forced to confront the very things that led to mistakes like his, then what was the point? Darius shifted slightly, as if debating something, and then spoke again. "You've got a choice, Harper. You can disappear. Let this be the end of you. Or you can do something with it." Harper frowned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying." Darius leaned forward, resting his arms on the bar. "You want to make this right? Then be a part of the change. Speak out. Tell other officers what happens when you let bias control your decisions. Help make sure the next guy doesn't end up where you are." Harper let out another laugh. But this time, it held something different, not bitterness, something closer to disbelief. "You think anyone wants to hear from me?" Darius held his gaze. "Maybe not, but that doesn't mean they don't need to." The weight of those words settled between them. And for the first time since this all began, Harper felt something other than regret. Purpose. The night stretched on, and they talked, not as enemies, not as cop and suspect, but as two men standing at a crossroads. And by the time Harper finally left the bar, his termination notice still folded in his pocket, he realized something. His life as a cop was over. But his chance to make a difference wasn't. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Maybe this was just the beginning. And if you believe that people can change, that accountability isn't the end but the first step towards something better. Then hit that like button and show your support. Because real change? It starts with conversations like this. And this is only the beginning. The city buzzed with an uneasy tension, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The streetlights flickered overhead, bathing the precinct in an eerie glow as Special Agent Darius Coleman stepped through the glass doors once more. But this time, there was no uncertainty in his stride, no tightness in his jaw. The battle inside the walls of this building was far from over. But he knew one thing for sure: change had begun, and he intended to see it through. Captain Laura Bennett stood in the hallway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. They had spoken many times over the last few weeks, but tonight felt different. The weight of reform, of making real and lasting change, pressed on her shoulders like never before. The department was shifting, officers forced to confront the uncomfortable truths that had long been ignored. But Darius had seen enough to know that change wasn't about policies on paper. It was about what happened in the hearts and minds of those who upheld the law. "You ready?" Bennett asked, her voice measured but holding something deeper beneath the surface: resolve. Maybe even hope. Darius nodded. "Always." They walked together down the long corridor, past officers who cast sidelong glances, some curious, others wary. Whispers had followed him since that fateful day in the park, but he had learned long ago not to let them shake him. At the far end of the hall, a conference room door stood ajar, the voices of committee members murmuring beyond it. The real work was about to begin. Meanwhile, in a rundown apartment on the other side of town, Wade Harper sat alone, staring at the badge that no longer belonged to him. It sat on the table in front of him, a stark reminder of everything he had lost. The past weeks had been a storm of hearings, of media scrutiny, of realization after realization that tore at the fabric of the man he had once believed himself to be. He had replayed the moment in the park 1,000 times in his mind, the way he had approached Darius, the assumptions he had made, the certainty with which he had acted. It was terrifying. In hindsight, how quickly he had let his bias dictate his actions. And now, stripped of his authority, of his rank, he found himself at a crossroads. He had spent so long defining himself by his badge. Who was he without it? A knock at his door broke the silence. Harper hesitated before rising, opening it to reveal an unfamiliar figure, a young black man, no older than 25, standing with an envelope in hand. "You don't know me," the young man started, shifting his weight, "but I know about you. And I thought, you should see this." Harper frowned, taking the envelope and watching as the man turned and disappeared down the hallway before he could ask any questions. He stepped back inside, hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. It was from someone he had arrested years ago. A wrongful arrest. A man who had lost months of his life fighting charges that never should have been brought against him. And yet, There was no hatred in the words. No anger, just a plea. A plea for Harper to take what had happened and do something with it. His hands clenched around the letter. And for the first time in weeks, he felt something other than shame. A purpose. A way forward. Maybe he couldn't undo the past, but he could choose what he did with the future. Back at the precinct, the meeting stretched into the night. Policies were debated, training programs adjusted, but as Darius listened, he realized that the most important changes weren't happening at the table. They were happening in the officers who sat around it. The ones who had once dismissed his concerns, now forced to acknowledge their own blind spots. The ones who had scoffed at reform, now listening. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick, but it was happening. As the meeting wrapped up, Bennett turned to Darius. You think this is enough? Darius exhaled, glancing around the room before shaking his head. No, but it's a start. Outside, the city stretched before him, alive with possibility. He knew there would be more battles ahead, more moments where the weight of the fight threatened to pull him under. But tonight, as he walked away from the precinct, he carried something with him that hadn't always been there. Hope. And for those who have followed this journey, who believe in change and justice, drop a comment below. What do you think should happen next? How do we keep this fight going? And if you want to support these conversations, hit that like button and subscribe. Because this is only the beginning. The city pulsed with life. Yet within its veins ran an undercurrent of change, subtle yet powerful. As Special Agent Darius Coleman stepped out of the precinct for what felt like the 100th time, he knew the world outside hadn't suddenly transformed, but something within him had. His journey through the cracks of a flawed system, the weight of injustice that had pressed against him, had led to this moment, not a victory, but a beginning. The air felt different, the streetlights casting their glow in a way that almost felt like acknowledgement. As if even the city itself had taken note of what had happened within those walls. But Darius knew better than to get lost in illusions. Real change wasn't in symbolic gestures. It was in the work. The continuous, exhausting, but necessary work. Back inside the precinct, Captain Laura Bennett sat at her desk, fingers tapping against the wood, her mind still sifting through everything that had transpired. Policies were rewritten, training programs established, accountability measures reinforced, yet, none of it would matter if the culture remained unchanged. She had always believed in justice. But now she understood that belief alone wasn't enough. It required action, commitment, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. She glanced at the now vacant desk where Wade Harper once sat. A stark reminder that for real transformation, consequences had to be part of the equation. Across town, in the dim quiet of his small apartment, Harper stared at the blank walls that had once been filled with commendations. Memories of a career he had thought defined him. The badge that had once symbolized honor and duty lay untouched on the table. Stripped of its power, he had lost everything, but in that loss, something new was growing, an understanding he had never allowed himself to embrace before. The system hadn't failed him. He had failed the system by refusing to see beyond the authority he wielded. Now, without that authority, he had a choice: to fade into obscurity, or to rebuild himself into someone better, someone worthy of redemption. Meanwhile, Darius found himself standing outside a community center, a place where real conversations happened, where the people affected most by systemic failures gathered not just to share their grievances, but to seek solutions. He walked inside, greeted by familiar faces, activists, neighbors, even a few officers who had begun to recognize that protecting and serving meant more than just enforcing the law. It meant understanding the people they served. He took a deep breath, stepping forward to join the discussion. This was where change lived. In the quiet persistence of those who refused to accept that the way things had always been was the way they had to remain. The world had not changed overnight. Racism had not been eradicated. Power still held privilege, and justice still required constant vigilance. But tonight, as Darius looked around, as he saw people of all backgrounds coming together to push forward, he knew that hope was not an illusion. It was a force. Just like injustice, except this force had momentum, driven by people who refused to give up. And to those who have followed this story, who believe in the power of accountability, of reform, and of human dignity, your voice matters. Change is not a spectator sport. It requires engagement, dialogue, and the courage to stand up even when it's uncomfortable. If this story has made you think, If it has stirred something in you, take that feeling and turn it into action. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and be part of the conversation. And if you believe in more stories that challenge, inspire, and push for a better world, hit that like button and subscribe. Because this is only the beginning.